Tonight we continue in 2 Timothy, and we're going to look at chapter 3, and we're going to focus on verses 6 through 11. A quick review since we had a business meeting last week. Paul writes this book. It's his final book. He's in prison in Rome. He writes it to Timothy, who's in Ephesus. So somebody takes the book to Timothy. Timothy reads it. And one of the things that Paul wants Timothy to do is leave Ephesus and come see him for a final time in Rome. There are two big issues that Timothy is dealing with. In fact, the Christian world in the first century had to deal with these same two big issues. And the first one is ministry stamina, and part of that was persecution. Persecution is broken out, and Paul wants Timothy to remain loyal to Christ, and Paul also wants Timothy to remain loyal to him, even if it involves suffering. So Paul wants Timothy to go see him in Rome, even if Timothy gets arrested in the process. So Timothy, apparently at this point, has never really experienced any severe persecution, and Paul wants to prepare him for the possibility that that could happen. And apparently it does happen to Timothy somewhere along the way, so he needs to be prepared. And so Paul writes this first part of the letter to prepare him for that. We're in this second part of the letter, which is an appeal for sound doctrine. So in addition to persecution and all the difficulties that that brings, the other issue is false teachers in the church at Ephesus who are teaching false doctrine. And tonight we're going to learn that Paul absolutely feels these false teachers are not Christians at all. So what they are teaching is absolutely wrong. They're deceiving people, leading people astray. And the last thing Paul wants to see is for Timothy to be led astray. So Paul writes this letter to encourage Timothy to remain strong in his faith. Paul addressed that issue back in 1 Timothy. In fact, most of 1 Timothy is about the false teachers and what they were doing, but that letter did not solve the problem. In fact, we have evidence that the problem got worse instead of getting better. And so Paul tackles that same issue again here in 2 Timothy. What Paul wants Timothy to do is to confront the false teaching and living. Paul wants Timothy to take the lead in dealing with this. He left him there for that purpose. Paul exposes the false teaching in this section. He talks about the dangers of the false teaching as well. And Paul wants Timothy to resist the false teaching, to separate himself from the false teaching, and finally to try to correct the false teaching. So the false teachers have deceived a lot of people, and some of those can be won back if Timothy's able to correct the situation. Last week we began this section called Conditions in the Last Days. And Paul writes about all the bad things that are going to happen in the last days. In fact, it's a vice list of 18 negative characteristics. And it's interesting that these characteristics Paul applies to the false teachers, which raises the question, why is it about the last days? Well, the New Testament understands the phrase, the last days, a little bit differently than what we use that term today. According to the New Testament, the last days began with Jesus, with his ministry, his crucifixion, his death, his burial, his resurrection, then his ascension into heaven. And the last days will culminate when Jesus returns to the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. So it's almost been 2,000 years. In fact, in 6 years it will be 2,000 years since that took place. So all of that period of time is called the last days. Why is it called the last days? Well, Jesus is God's last agenda for planet Earth. The book of Hebrews talks about the fact that, in former days, God spoke through the prophets. He spoke through Moses and the law. But in these last days, he's spoken through his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things. So God's last message of salvation for planet Earth is his Son, Jesus. In other words, there's not going to be another alternative to Jesus. Jesus is God's last plan. God's not going to go, okay, the Jesus thing lasted 2,000 years. Now let me try something else. That's not going to happen. Jesus is the last plan. And that's why it's called the last days. The days of Jesus are the last days. Of course, we want to know, are we living in the last days of the last days? That's what we really want to know. And that's a question that Christians have been asking for the past 2,000 years. The disciples were the first to ask that question of Jesus before he ascended. They asked him, Jesus, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel? Is this the time? Is this the time for the kingdom and the great age? And Jesus says, no. In fact, I don't know when that's going to happen. So I can't even answer your question. So if Jesus doesn't know when he's coming back, any guess that we have is just that. It's a guess. But it's interesting that those 18 characteristics that Paul attributes to the false teachers, we can attribute those same 18 characteristics to our culture today. Our secular, non-believing culture. You can read those 18 things and go, yeah, that's the world that I live in. All I have to do is turn on the news or Google the news, and there are all those 18 characteristics in my world too. So Paul was living in the last days. We're living in the last days too. We just don't know when the last days of the last days are actually going to take place. So, conditions in the last days. In verses 1 through 5, the 18 characteristics. And then in the last part of verse 5, Paul tells Timothy to separate himself from people who act that way. In other words, stay away from the false teachers in the sense that don't you get lumped in with them. You are separate from them. You are to teach the truth. You are to teach the things that are true about Christianity and not get sucked into all of this false teaching that's taking place in the church. Then in verses 6 through 9, Paul's going to talk about the actions of these false teachers. So we've got a pretty good description of their character. Well, what exactly were they doing? And why is what they were doing so wrong? And Paul's going to describe that in verses 6 through 9. In verses 6 and 7, he's going to give us two things that they absolutely were doing. And then in verses 8 and 9, Paul's conclusion is that these are religious phonies. These are deceivers, and we should not be following them. So, let me read verses 6 through 9, which will wrap up this section, and then we'll take a look again at what's going on with these false teachers. So again, beginning in verse 6, Paul is still talking about the false teachers. So 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 6 through 9. They are the kind who worm their way into homes and gain control over gullible women who are loaded down with sins and are swayed by all kinds of evil desires, always learning, but never able to come to a knowledge of the truth. Just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses, so also these teachers oppose the truth. They are men of depraved minds who, as far as the faith is concerned, are rejected. But they will not get very far because, as in the case of those men, their folly will be clear to everyone. So beginning in verse 6, Paul's going to talk about what these false teachers are actually doing. And they worm their way into homes. And worming their way in speaks of deception. It speaks of evil. It speaks of the fact that they are entering homes under false pretense. They are claiming to be teachers of Christianity, but what they actually teach is not Christianity at all. They worm their way into homes. When we hear the word homes, we think about a person's house, a place where people live, which is true. But back in the first century, Christians did not have church buildings like we do today. They don't have a beautiful building like we do. They actually met in people's homes. So they called those house churches. So the church at Ephesus may have had as many as 10 to 20 different house churches. We call those small groups today that meet in people's homes, D-Life groups and small groups. And each of these house churches would have an elder who would be leading that particular house church. And apparently these false teachers have wormed their way into the house churches, where they can have a lot of influence. Some of them are even the elders of the church. So the elders, they've wormed their way into the point where now they're elders in the church, which gives them free license to teach and to speak and to influence. And they're doing it in a very negative way. They're also gaining control. And that was the big issue. I mean, if they wormed their way in and everybody heard what they had to say and said, no, not going to follow that, not going to believe that, then it would have died out. But instead, they're gaining control. And the whole idea of gaining control is they have psychological dominance over their victims. So apparently they're pretty slick in what they have to say. And what they're offering seems to be something that people want, and they're buying into it. So who are the primary victims of this false teaching? And Paul describes them as gullible women. So apparently the women are the ones who are following the false teachers. At least predominantly that is true. These women lack spiritual insight. They may also lack moral character. Now, it's interesting that Paul describes women, or at least the women at Ephesus, in this way. In most of Paul's writings, he's very positive in his approach toward women. Now, you have to keep in mind, this is the first century. It's truly a man's world. It's a man's culture. As I tell women all the time, be thankful you weren't born in the first century. Because the moment you were born, you were owned by your father. And the moment you got married, which chances are your father arranged your marriage, you are now owned by your husband. So that was the life of a woman in the first century. And I think a lot of these women were attention-starved. That's part of the issue. And so they become gullible to this false teaching. Paul, again, normally has very positive things to say about women. And not all the women at Ephesus are deceived. In fact, Paul will mention Priscilla in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 19. Priscilla and Aquila, and of that couple, it was Priscilla who was the teacher. And she and Paul were very good friends, and Paul had nothing but good to say about her. So Paul is not necessarily anti-women. Sometimes he gets portrayed that way. Now, it's interesting that some scholars believe that what Paul has to say about women in 1 Timothy has a lot to do with these gullible women. So in 1 Timothy chapter 2, chapter 3, and chapter 5, Paul is telling women, to be quiet in the worship, not to teach, to be obedient to your husband, not to interrupt. And a lot of this has to do with what was these gullible women and what they were doing in the house churches. So apparently these gullible women were creating a lot of confusion and instability in the house churches because they were following the teachings of the false teachers and spreading those kinds of things. So reading those instructions to women in light of these gullible women kind of gives us a different insight on what Paul is saying. Paul is trying to solve a problem that's not being solved. So Paul is not anti-female. In fact, he has more positive things to say about women than just about anybody in the first century. And so did Jesus, by the way, who, being resurrected, appeared first to the women. So Jesus wasn't anti-women either. Well, Paul goes on to describe these women in 5 characteristics. And the first, he calls them gullible women. Literally weak and silly women. They are easily deceived and prone to temptation. And again, with a woman's status in the first century, they may have been emotionally starved for attention. Maybe some of their husbands weren't giving them attention, and so these false teachers were. And so they were very interested in what the false teachers had to say. Of course, not realizing that they were false teachers, these women thought that these men were very godly, and they were telling these incredible stories of how they connected with angels, and they were given secret knowledge. And perhaps these false teachers were passing along that secret knowledge to some of these women. And the women go, wow, I used to feel inferior, but now that I've got this special knowledge, I'm feeling pretty good about myself. And so they kind of fed into each other. So they were gullible in that sense. They were loaded down with sins. And this may have been what attracted them to Christianity in the first place, because Jesus offers forgiveness of our sins. So a lot of these women may have been immoral. They may have had a lifestyle that was, most of them were Greeks. And the Greeks were not known for their morality. And so a lot of them committed all kinds of sins before they became a Christian. And so being loaded down with sins, they're looking for any answer they can find to deal with their shame and guilt. So if somebody comes along with an answer for their shame and guilt, they're all ears. And perhaps the false teachers were saying, well, what you need for your shame and guilt is you need knowledge. And I can give you some knowledge that's been passed on to me. And so because of that, they are loaded down with their sins, but not looking to Christ for the answer. Then they're swayed by all kinds of evil desires. The Greeks were curious people. A lot of them liked novel things that were new. And also they were very self-centered. If they could find something that would make them superior to others, they really enjoyed that. And so these women were very curious, and somebody was feeding their self-esteem, and they enjoyed that. Now, whether these women were also immoral and whether something was going on between the false teachers and these women, scholars debate that, and nobody really knows for sure, and there's no way to find out for sure. So there's a possibility that was going on as well. So you can picture a Greek woman who is being ignored by her husband because, he owns her, so he never read the book on the 5 love languages or, 10 things a guy needs to know about his wife. He's never read that book. And so he's ignoring her, but here these false teachers are showing her a lot of attention, and you can write the rest of the story from that point on. So, again, these women became vulnerable because of that. Verse 7 gives us a great insight into what's going on. They're always learning, meaning they're forever getting information. The Greeks loved knowledge. Intellectual things were just something that just clicked with them. So if somebody had a new doctrine or a new idea, they were going, come and tell me about that. I want to hear about that. I've never heard anything about that before, so inform me about this new doctrine, this new philosophy, this new idea. In Acts chapter 17, Paul goes to Athens, and he ends up with the intellectuals. And he decides to engage them in conversation and talk to them about Christ. And Paul was doing really well until he mentioned the resurrection. Because again, for the Greeks, they thought the body was evil. It's like, what do you want to resurrect a body for? That didn't make any sense to them. But here's how they're described. All the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. That was the typical Greek person. The intellectual who liked to just discuss ideas and talk about them, and if somebody's got a new idea, I've got to hear about it. So these women fit into that category. Oh, a new idea? New knowledge from an angel? Oh, tell me. I'm all ears here. Inform me about all of this. So they were always learning. They had an insatiable curiosity about religion. The problem is they had no discernment to distinguish between truth and error. But they were very curious about what was being said. They're always learning, but they never come to a knowledge of the truth. How sad. that with all of their learning, they never discover the truth. Paul writes in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 4, that God wants all people to come to a knowledge of the truth. And the truth has the definite article, the truth, meaning the truth about Christ, the truth about Christianity. So here are these Greek intellectuals sharing ideas, religious ideas, ideas they supposedly got from angels and spirit beings, and they thought they were getting smart and very religious, but the whole time they were missing the truth about Christ and Christianity. Always learning, but never coming to a knowledge of the truth. But yet these women, according to 1 Timothy chapter 6, were more than willing to pay these false teachers for all of this knowledge and wisdom they were supposedly giving them. And so here's this great idea that keeps floating around, and they're willing to pay for those ideas. Today, it's the person who kind of jumps from denomination to denomination, from church to church, because they say it just a little bit different. So, they're a Methodist for a while, but okay, they've heard all the Methodists have to offer. So let's become a Presbyterian. Or let's try the Catholic Church, and, that's different. And so they just kind of jump around. And it's sad that so many people jump around from church to church, denomination to denomination, but never really embrace the truth of Christianity. Years ago, I went on vacation to Colonial Williamsburg, and the setting was 1775, right before the Revolution. And they had one of the topics of that day when I was there, religion in the colony. And so I showed up for that one, very curious about what they would do. And somebody came out dressed as a preacher would be dressed in 1775, and he memorized one of the sermons that somebody gave back then, and he gave the sermon. And I can't remember the exact sermon, but it was on the book of Acts, and it was basically a salvation message. And I was going, that would preach today. And it would, because the message of Christianity hasn't changed in 2,000 years. It's still all about Christ. It's all about His cross. It's all about His resurrection, His ascension, and His coming again. The message hasn't changed. So Christianity has stability in that sense, that the message never changes. But for the Greeks, Christianity, that was like last month. What do you got today that's different? What's new today? Well, nothing. Christianity's not going to change. There's nothing new except for growing and learning more about Christ. So that was part of what was going on here in this church. So then we talk about two men that are mentioned here in 2 Timothy, Jannes and Jambres. And these two individuals are never mentioned in the Old Testament. However, they were two of the magicians that served Pharaoh. When Moses went in before Pharaoh and started doing some miracles, these magicians were able to replicate and duplicate several of Moses' miracles. For example, Moses would take his staff and throw it down on the ground, and it became a snake. And then Moses would pick it up by its tail. Why, I have no idea. You don't pick up a snake by its tail, but he did, and it becomes a staff again. Well, apparently Jannes and Jambres could pull that off too. And so even though their names are not mentioned in the Old Testament, in some Jewish writings they are mentioned. There's something called the Targum of Jonathan. And the Targum was a translation. It was a translation of the Hebrew into Aramaic, because that's what the Jewish people spoke back in the first century. And some of these translations were also a commentary, because they would add stuff to it. And so their commentary on Exodus chapter 7, verse 11, added the names of the magicians. Also, there was a document from the priest of Zadok, that family in the Qumran sect, who told the story this way, in which Belial which Belial was a name for Satan or the devil, set up Johanna, which is Janus, and his brother to challenge Moses. So according to Qumran, these two guys are brothers, and they're both magicians. And also according to Qumran, Satan appointed them to challenge Moses. And of course, for a while, they could duplicate what Moses did. But after a while, they had to say, can't do that one. Moses wins that one. And so they were able to deceive for a while, but they couldn't keep up with what God could do through Moses. And it says, these teachers, like them, oppose the truth. So Paul makes a comparison between the false teachers and these Egyptian magicians. And could it be that Paul is thinking, these people claim to get all of this knowledge from angels and from spirit beings. Were they using magic to do that? Was it part of the occult that they were using? And I don't think it's going too far to say that Paul would say, if they're getting messages, they're probably getting messages from demons, not from angels. So here's these occult leaders back in the Old Testament, and that's what Paul accuses them of in the first century. So they oppose the truth, which means they're not Christians because, again, the truth has the definite article. They oppose the truth of Christianity. So whatever they were teaching, whatever they were doing was not Christian. And Paul was calling them out. He describes them in a couple other ways. They have depraved minds. The idea of being depraved is the idea of corrupt. It's the idea of their minds are distorted. In fact, they are so distorted in their thinking that even when they hear the truth of Christianity, they can't comprehend it. Their minds are just that warped. And unfortunately, people can get to that point where their minds are so distorted that the message of Christianity doesn't even resonate with them. So that was one of their characteristics. It's also mentioned, by the way, in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 5. Also, it talks about the fact that as far as the faith, and the faith has the definite article, the faith meaning the Christian message, as far as that is concerned, they're rejected because their message is not about Christ. Their message is about other things. So Paul is very straightforward in what he has to say about these false teachers. So stay away from them, Timothy. They're not even Christians. And what they are proclaiming is not Christian. They have depraved minds and they are rejecting the Christian message, and the Christian message will reject them as well. Then Paul holds out great hope. They're not going to get very far because as in the case of those men, their folly will be clear to everyone. And that's the great hope, that the more people hear them talk and see their behavior, they're going to go, these aren't Christians. These guys are phonies. I can see right through them. And for those of you who have the spiritual gift of discernment, you have the ability to do that. Someone may get up and proclaim to be a Christian, and, most people go, yeah, they're such wonderful Christians. And you're going, I don't think so. I got all kinds of bells and whistles and warning signs going off inside my head that what these people are representing is not Christianity at all. And Paul apparently had that kind of gift. And so he was saying, they're not Christians, and I just pray that the rest of you understand that and realize and not follow their false teachings. Because these two Egyptian magicians, they kept up with Moses for a while, but eventually, they couldn't. And so they're hoping, Paul's hoping, that this won't go very far, and their folly, their bad behavior will be clear to everyone. And eventually that was true. This is in the 60s. Certainly by the 90s, the church at Ephesus had rejected all of that false teaching. So it may have taken a while, but eventually they said no to all the false teaching. Well, let's move on to Paul's charge to Timothy to give him strength to endure. Putting yourself in the place of Timothy, you're dealing with potential persecution. Persecution has definitely broken out in Rome, and Paul wants you to go there. It's kind of like, there's a hurricane coming to such and such a city, and you decide to vacation there. It's like, why did you go there if you knew the hurricane was coming? Why are you going to Rome if you know persecution is breaking out in Rome? But that's where Timothy is headed at Paul's request. So Timothy's going to have to deal with persecution. He's also going to have to deal with false teachings. How would you like Timothy's job? Any volunteers to take Timothy's place? That's a tough job. And the question becomes, where's Timothy going to find encouragement and strength to deal with this? Because this is going to be a tough situation. Well, in these verses, in chapter 3, verses 10 through 17, Paul wants to encourage Timothy. And he's going to encourage Timothy in a couple of different ways. When it comes to persecution, and Timothy apparently hasn't experienced that yet. So he's going to need an illustration of how to handle persecution. And Paul's going to use his own life and ministry as that illustration. Paul says, I've been persecuted, and I want you to handle it the same way that I handled it. So Timothy's going to have a model, an example, an illustration of how to handle persecution. The second issue is false teaching. So, what can help us find strength in knowing what is right and what is wrong? If somebody says something, what can we do to figure out if they're telling the truth, that, if they're right, or if what they're saying is wrong and we should reject it? And Paul's going to point Timothy to the instruction of the Holy Scriptures. That's where we go to find encouragement. In terms of dealing with false teaching. If we know the truth of Scripture, we'll spot an error very quickly. So Paul wants Timothy to immerse himself in the Scriptures so that he knows them very well, so that he can spot false teaching. So this particular section divides into two. In verses 10 through 13, it's about how to handle persecution. Verses 14 through 17 is about how to handle false teaching and error. And Paul's going to point to himself as the example of dealing with persecution. He begins verse 10 by saying, you, however, addressing Timothy. Literally in the Greek it says, but as for you. And in verse 14, Paul's going to say the same line. Timothy, but as for you. So Paul's been talking about the false teachers. And now he's saying to Timothy, but as for you, meaning you're not one of them. So you're different. This is the way of the false teachers, but you're different. You're the opposite of them. So the false teachers and Timothy stand in contrast to each other. What we find in verse 10 are a lot of virtues. So we've had our vice list back in verses 2 through 5. In verses 10 and 11, we're going to get a virtue list. So instead of those vices being true about you, may all of these virtues be true about you. Now, those vices, they're true of the false teachers. But Timothy, that's not you. I want these virtues to be true in your life. And then Paul begins by saying, as for you, Timothy, you know all about my teaching, my way of life, my purpose, my faith, my patience, my love, my endurance. Timothy, you know all about me. You've been with me long enough that you know me. You know how I behave. You know what I teach. You know what I believe. You know those things. And it's interesting that that word know has the same idea of Luke chapter 1, verse 3, where Luke says that he carefully investigated everything about the life of Christ. Now, Luke never met Christ while Jesus was on earth. But Luke investigated Jesus and Jesus' followers. He did his research. So in essence, Paul is saying, Timothy, you've done your research about me. You've been with me. You've seen me. You've heard me. You know about me. So you're able to know certain things about how I live my life. And I want you to live your life the same way I live mine. And he begins by talking about, actually there's 9 things, and the first one is my teaching. You know my teaching. In other words, this is the gospel that Paul proclaims. And Timothy has been on mission trips with Paul. And Timothy has heard Paul preach the gospel again and again. He's heard Paul's lessons, his teachings, dozens of times. In fact, there's a great verse in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17, as Paul is talking to the Corinthians. For this reason I have sent to you Timothy, my son, whom I love, who is faithful in the Lord. He will remind you of my way of life in Christ Jesus. So Paul says to the church at Corinth, you want to know about me? I'm sending Timothy. He knows all about me. He knows about my way of life. He also knows, which agrees with what I teach everywhere in every church. And what Paul teaches in one church, he teaches in all the churches. You know, Paul's not a Greek who changes his philosophy, several times a month. What Paul teaches in one church, he teaches in every church. And it's interesting that those first 2 things that Paul mentions in 2 Timothy 3:10 are his teaching and his way of life. And those same 2 things are mentioned in 1 Corinthians 4:17. So Paul is saying about Timothy, you know exactly about my teaching. Also, Timothy knows about Paul's way of life. The guiding principles that Paul lives by. I was thinking about that. Do you have some guiding principles to dictate how you live your life? For those of you who were in business at one point, did you have some guiding principles about how you conducted your business? Maybe some guiding principles about how you handled money? Some guiding principles about how you handle relationships? We need those. And, of course, Paul would have gotten his from the Scriptures, and we should too. And Paul's guiding principles were in sharp contrast to the vices of the false teachers. Paul lived with integrity in everything that he did. And Timothy saw that time and time again, how Paul handled difficult circumstances. If you want to know what your character's like and what your guiding principles really are like, just get into a difficult circumstance and observe your own behavior. You can find out a lot about you when you're handling difficult circumstances because your character will show up whether you want it to or not. And hopefully it's good character that will show up. His way of life. Also his purpose. Paul's purpose, single-minded commitment to Christ. In fact, I love that verse in Philippians, for to me to live is Christ. That was Paul's purpose. I live for Jesus. And if you were with Paul for any length of time, all that man talks about is Jesus. His entire life revolves around Jesus. That was Paul. And Timothy knew it. Well, I'm going to let you read the rest of this because I'm out of time if you want ice cream. And there is ice cream available tonight. So there's other characteristics, faith, patience, love, endurance, persecution, and sufferings. And we're going to pick up next week with the rest of verse 11, which talks about those persecutions, those sufferings, those afflictions that Paul went through, some of which Timothy actually saw in person. And Timothy witnessed those. And so Paul becomes a great illustration for Timothy about how to deal with persecutions. The great thing about the church is that we have an opportunity as Christians to share our stories with one another. Because as Christians, the first time we face something, we don't necessarily know what to do. The first time, you're diagnosed with an illness, like, what do I do as a Christian? Well, if you have some Christian brothers and sisters who've been through that very thing that you're going through, they can become an illustration about how to handle things. God put us in this together to help each other. And so Paul's trying to help Timothy. And that's why we have small groups. That's why we have D-Life groups, so that people can share their story, pray for each other, and be there for each other. So think about that. You may know somebody in your life who's been through something you've been through. Or maybe you're going through something new and you're looking for who's been through this, who can help me know what to do. So we are here for each other. Heavenly Father, thank you for this portion of Scripture. Father, thank you for the encouragement that Paul brings to Timothy. And may we be an encouragement to the people you place in our life, and may they be an encouragement to us as well. Father, may we learn what the Bible says so that we know what truth really looks like, so that we're not deceived, so that we know the truth, stand for the truth, and live for the truth. So, Father, may we be good students of your word so that we can know what you have taught us. Father, I thank you that we have this opportunity to share life together, and I pray that we will help each other in our journey, no matter what we're facing or going through. I pray in Jesus' name, amen.